The reason currencies exist is because they make trading a lot easier. Let's look at an example that illustrates this. Let's assume that there's a town, and in that town there's someone called Joe. This is going to be Joe, and we're going to assume that Joe makes shoes for a living. Now let's assume that one day Joe wakes up and Joe decides that he would really like to eat some bread. So in a world where there's no currency, Joe basically has to find someone who's willing to exchange the shoes that he makes for bread. So let's sort of quantify this problem. Let's assume that in Joe's town there's a total of 195 people. And let's assume that this circle over here, this represents all the people who want shoes. And we're going to assume that this number over here is 100. So 100 people in Joe's town want shoes. Now let's also assume that this circle over here, this represents people who have bread. And we're going to assume that there's a total of 100 people who have bread. And this overlap over here, let me just use another color. So this overlap over here, that represents people who want shoes and who have bread. So I'm going to write that up over here. People want shoes and have bread. And we're going to assume that there's 5 of them. So, as you can see, the number of people who want shoes who don't have bread, which is this section over here, would be 95, because it's 100, which is the total circle, minus the union over here, which is 5. And the people who have bread who don't want shoes is also 95. Again, it's this entire circle over here, that's 100 people, minus the union, which is 5. So now Joe's problem is to find one of these 5 people, because he needs someone who's willing to accept his shoes in return for bread. So he needs someone who wants shoes and has bread. And so his problem is to find one of the 5 out of 195 people who want shoes and have bread. Now, as you can imagine, this is a pretty difficult thing to do. I mean, finding 5 out of 195 people isn't easy. So now let's imagine that Joe's town has a common currency, and this common currency is gold coins, let's assume. So now Joe's problem is a little bit different. He has to find someone who wants his shoes, and then he can go to them and exchange his shoes for money, which is the gold coins, and then take those gold coins and find someone who has bread and exchange those gold coins for bread. So now his problem is a little bit different. His problem now is to find one of the 100 out of 195 people, so that's anyone in this circle over here, so anyone in that circle over here who wants his shoes, and then he has to go and find one of the people in this circle over here who has bread. And he has to find them independently of each other. So then he has to go and find 1 out of 195 people who have bread. Now, as you look at these numbers and you think about it for a second, you notice that the second problem is much easier. It's much easier to find 1 out of all these people over here and separately find 1 out of all these people over here than to try to find one of these 5 people in the overlap. And so you can see how having a common currency in Joe's town makes trading a lot easier. In this case, it makes it much more likely that Joe will be able to eat bread, and it also makes it much more likely that someone out there will be able to appreciate Joe's work with his shoes.